Okay, hi everyone. We are on to chapter two. So at this point, you should have finished the chapter one assignment and completed the chapter one lesson. If you had any issues with chapter one, please reach out to your teacher. They would be more than willing to help you out with anything that you need. Okay, so moving on to chapter two, our focus is going to be on individualism and collectivism. Most ideological beliefs fall into the category of some principles of individualism or some principles of collectivism or somewhere in the middle. Okay. If you see the word individualism and you see the word collectivism and you don't know what they mean, you could probably tie them to some words that you do know, right? Individualism, you should know what individual means, and you should know what collective means, right? So when you kind of add that ism to it, it's bound to be kind of a system of thought or an ideology. So we cannot escape the fact, as human beings, we are both individuals and part of a collective. So in chapter two, you will explore several different understandings of individualism and collectivism and how they're the foundation for a lot of political parties, political systems, governments, countries. Often, when we look at individualism and collectivism on a spectrum, we usually put collectivism on the right, or sorry, on the left, and individualism on the right. Right. So when you hear those words left wing or right wing, often you're talking about collectivism being left wing, individualism being right wing, right? Lots of freedom happens in the right, and a lot of equality happens in the left. And in the middle, you have a mix of both. So, individualist ideologies tend to advocate for individual rights and freedoms, freedom from government, from collective controls, from restrictions, and they often promote principles such as autonomy, self interest, personal achievement, and self reliance. Where on the flip side, collectivist ideologies endorse the idea of working cooperatively, right? To solve problems together, manage economic and social issues together. In collectivism, enterprises or companies, unions, all of those things work as a collective rather than individual to accomplish kind of more collective goals. Collective ideologies also stress social harmony and cohesion over competitiveness, right? So rather than I'm trying to make more money than you, we are making money together, or we are benefiting our whole society together. Collective ideologies see a positive role for government. Government has an important role to play in collectivist ideologies, and especially in kind of the assistance and control in regard of the economy and social issues. Whereas individualist ideologies usually see government as interfering and counterproductive. So, in this chapter, we are going to examine two major things. One, the interaction of individualism and collectivism in society by considering how these two tendencies underline different ideologies to varying degrees. And can they be reconciled, right? Can we look at individualism and collectivism together? Can they work together? Or do societies need to pick and choose collectivism or individualism? And there are times where they don't mix, and there are times where they absolutely can mix. And number two, the impact of these dynamically linked tendencies on society, as well as their influence on personal identity. As you deliberate the chapter issue, to what extent are individualism and collectivism foundations of ideology? So there you go, another to what extent question. So, individualism, there are many different ideologies based on some degree of individualism, and they do not all agree on the best means for organizing society. Nonetheless, most individualistic ideologies have a similar understanding of the individual's place in society, and they stress the importance of ideas such as personal autonomy, uh, meaning a state of individual freedom from outside authority, and self reliance, the quality of being solely responsible for one's own well being. Liberalism is central to individualist thought. The word liberal, not to be confused with the Liberal Party of Canada or anything like that. The word liberal actually comes from the French word liberty, and liberty translates to freedom. Okay, when words end in ism, it means that it's a practice, system, or philosophy. So, liberalism is the ideology that focuses on broadly talking about individual freedom. Okay. We're going to talk tons about liberalism. Please don't get it confused with the Liberal Party, right? Also, I've been hearing a lot, oh, you liberal, to describe someone who's progressive or something like that. That doesn't necessarily relate to the term liberalism and its actual meaning. So, in this course, liberalism is the ideology that broadly talks about freedom. And we're going to talk about lots of different forms of liberalism: classical liberalism, modern liberalism, contemporary liberalism. All of those pieces we're going to learn more later. But liberalism and individualism are kind of one and the same. Collectivism, like individualism, collectivism is not a single ideology, right? Like if you called yourself a collectivist, I would get a sense of your values and beliefs, but it's not specific enough to like locate you, right? So, like communism is a collectivist ideology, socialism is a collectivist ideology. So, there's kind of a list, right? There's democratic socialism, utopian socialism, right? Marxism, right? All of those are specific ideologies that fall under that collectivist umbrella. Okay. So many different ideologies are based on collectivist ideas, and these various ideologies may differ in their methods and ultimate goal. All of them, however, stress human interdependence. So, interdependence means linked together, working together, interconnected, and the importance of collective, regardless of size, rather than the importance of the individual. The focus of collectivists is the community and society. Although families can be collectivist in principles by encouraging members to be responsible for one another rather than simply looking out for themselves. Collectivist, Collectivism emphasizes group goals and the common good over individual goals or individual gain. I read that quite poorly about families. So you could be collectivist on a family level and think about, oh, but like I want my family to look after each other and not look after other families, right? So maybe you believe in collectivist principles for your family and maybe your nuclear family or your extended family, but not necessarily all of society. Or you can look at all of society as kind of a collectivist group looking after the common good. So, some early understandings of individualism and collectivism exist throughout time. And so, we're going to take a couple looks at them. So, the first being self interest. So, the concept of self interest was discussed in the 4th century BCE by the Greek philosopher Aristotle in his Politics. That which is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it. Everyone thinks chiefly of his own, hardly at all of the common interest, and only when he is himself concerned as an individual. Other principles of individualism, such as individual rights and freedoms, have become widely accepted, and only more, can I move this, recently in history. So if you look at Aristotle, his words, you can kind of look that he is being maybe a little bit critical of self-interest here, um, and maybe favors a little bit more collectivism. Examples of collectivism can also be found in a lot of ancient cultures. Anthropological studies tell us that most, if not all, the earliest human societies were collectivist because it was possible to survive only by working and hunting as part of a group. The sense of identity of ancient societies was largely based on membership in a group, usually an extended family, right? So when we look at our very beginning as humans, and the amount of skills needed, just in one particular family or one particular group. It was so important that everyone worked together. It was really hard to go out and do things on your own as an individual, because of the need to survive, right? And so our society looks very different than the societies that have existed in the past. And some believe that we need to kind of get back to that collectivist identity, and some believe that we need to focus more on the individual. When we talk about collectivism, it's really hard to ignore, a lot of indigenous perspectives, because many indigenous peoples describe their traditional cultures as having a strong sense of collective, right? Even when we look at land ownership, in indigenous communities. So, for us in this area, reserves or Métis settlements, the land ownership is owned by the whole community. You can't sell your home or the area that you are farming or living on to someone else, because it is technically owned by the community, right? And then other things like decision making, education, raising, children. Many indigenous cultures emphasize thinking and acting collectively to achieve what is best for the common good of the community. Many of these collectivist traditions are still practiced in many indigenous communities. I'm going to skip over this, but this is a really good quote by an Anuk elder, talking about, early understandings of collectivism in her community. So the medieval period, circa 476, to the Renaissance. So Pax Roman, the Peace of Rome, which had previously structured, and security through the empire, was replaced by lawlessness and unpredictability. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe was thrown into chaos, right? So there was a lot of, political control. And then when the Roman Empire collapsed, there was a ton of freedom, which was, identified as kind of chaos. Over time, order was restored in small areas under the guidance of local warlords. Small pockets of structure eventually grew into larger and larger areas as warlords and, nobles joined together and aristocracy was established. Common people were provided structure and physical security in exchange for their loyalty and service to their lords, but the individual life had very little worth. The common person was worth little more than a shrub or the cow on the land owned by the lord. The medieval period. So the spiritual ruler, the Roman Catholic Church, held immense power as the gatekeeper of heaven. One result of this situation was that people focused less on the things of the material world and more on making it to the afterlife. Therefore, developments in art, science, commerce, and progress in general were not emphasized, and the individual life here on earth mattered very little, right? So that period of time, a, a lot more collectivist than individualist, right? Because your focus was, especially in the Roman Catholic area of Europe, was to be a good Catholic, to be a good Christian, to make it to heaven. And then we have the Renaissance, right? Which is the spring of individualism. So, kind of in contrast to the medieval period, the Renaissance in Europe brought a greater interest in the individual. The term Renaissance comes from French, and it means rebirth. So, this period in European history was categorized by a renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman culture. European scholars revealed classical ideas about the central importance of life in the world, man's central role in the world, and the appreciation of the worth of the individual, right? Much of our beautiful classical art, food, all of those things come from the Renaissance. And it really was a move away from collectivism, where everyone was kind of eating the same things, um, doing the same type of art, to renew kind of like individual, like let's make new types of food, let's make new types of art, all of those things. And then the Protestant Reformation, especially when we're talking about the Roman Catholic Church, partially the product of growing influence of the Renaissance, focus on the potential of the individual in the world, also contributed to the growth of individualism by challenging the authority of the dominant Roman Catholic Church, right? So, Christianity, as a religion, has evolved because of individualism. People said, I don't know if this is the right interpretation of the Bible, for example, right? I don't think that the church is pushing us in the right direction. And so those individuals branched off into new collectives. So, the emergence of individualism in Europe, European societies, was a process that took several centuries. And while individualism eventually came to predominate in many societies, became predominant in many societies, it never replaced collectivism entirely, right? When we look back at the Protestant Reformation, right, even though it was individuals who challenged the Catholic Church, they then made new churches, and those new churches were new collectives, right? If we look, I'm in Fort Vermilion right now. We've got about four different churches, right? Each of those churches are on their own, doing not very different, but different teachings. Um, and those churches are also four different collectives, right? Those are groups of people who share teachings, values, and beliefs, right? So collectivism, even though at this time was kind of on its way out, it wasn't replaced with individualism. It just kind of took a new form. Not everyone was the same. There wasn't a level of conformity that existed before. There was a lot of individual differences, but there were still collective collectives that sprung out of that. The two tendencies have existed side by side, individualism and collectivism. Sometimes that relationship between the two are uneasy, um, but they continue to shape societies today, right? That struggle between how collectivist should we be, how individualist should we be. These are very important. So if you're taking notes, um, or if you have your textbook, to star the page that these are on, you'll also talk about them in the chapter assignment. But these are vital to understanding if something is individualist. It's definitely going to have um, one or more of these principles. And the same with collectivism. So, knowing these principles can help you identify whether something is individualist or something is collectivist. So, rule of law, individual rights of freedoms, private property, economic freedom, self interest, and competition are all principles of individualism. So if you or your collective or your group or your family believes in these principles, you are way more likely to fall in line with an individualist ideology than you are a collectivist ideology. And some people have like a 50-50 mix where they take some of these principles and some of the collectivist principles and follow both. So the first of those principles is the rule of law. So it's a democratic principle that's in a lot of liberal democracies around the world. So essentially, rule of law is that every individual is equal before the law. Okay. This principle means that citizens are subject to clearly defined rules rather than an arbitrary power of an individual or group in a position of authority, right? So, rule of law means that if we have a speed limit, every single person follows that speed limit. Whether you are 16 and you just got your driver's license, or you are the mayor of high level. Um, Everyone has to follow that speed limit, and everyone will have the consequences of not following that speed limit. So the rule of law states everyone follows the same laws, and those laws can't be easily changed, right? So it's very hard for a political figure, like let's say a prime minister or a premier, to change a lot of laws or rules in their favor without the checks and balances that exist. A good example of this is former Italian Prime Minister Silvio I can't say the last name, tried to use Italian immunity laws to avoid bribery charges. He was accused of trying to place himself above the law, and ultimately he lost the election and was charged under all of those pieces. So, if you ever feel like some people are above the law, then maybe we don't live in as democratic of a society as we may think. Individual rights and freedoms, very important principle. They are, and also a very important feature of liberal democracies. Rights and freedoms that exist here include freedom of religion, freedom of association, the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person. Um, and one important, very important individual right in liberal democracies is the right to vote. Most early liberal democracies did not extend this right to all citizens. For example, after the American and French Revolution, the right to vote was only granted to some men and mainly property owners. And then the women's right to vote, too, was a big struggle. In England, middle class men got the vote only in 1832. Working class men waited until 1885. English women were first able to vote only in 1919, and only if they were over the age of 30. In France, all men received the right to vote for the first time in 1789, and various classes of men lost and regained this right um, in the mid 1800s. When all men in France gained the right to vote, women were granted the right to vote in 1944. So much, much later. Um, in the early years of some states in the United States, voters had to be both male and Protestant to be able to vote. During the apartheid era, South Africa restricted the voting based on race, And Canada for years limited the right for Aboriginal peoples identified as status Indians to the right to vote. Only in 2004 did all prisoners in Canada become eligible to vote for federal elections. Now, however, the right to vote has extended in most democratic countries to include all citizens above a certain age. Usually, that age is either 18 or 21. Guaranteeing individual rights and freedoms can have negative consequences in certain circumstances, and liberal democracies attempt to balance the rights of one individual against the rights of other individuals, the rights of groups, and the needs of the goals of society. Therefore, we have laws that prohibit the promotion of hatred or discrimination, thus limiting the freedom of expression. So I think I mentioned this in chapter one. Even though we have the freedom of speech, or the freedom of expression, as it's called in Canada, uh, that freedom does not trump the right to be free from discrimination. In one extreme case, an Alberta high school teacher named James Keegstra was dismissed from his teaching position in 1982 for expressing views in his classroom that claimed that the Holocaust did not happen. Keegstra was eventually charged with unlawfully promoting hatred against an identifiable group, right? So he was anti Semitic. Meaning that he hated the Jewish population. And one of the ways that he peddled that anti Semitic view was to claim that the Holocaust never happened. From the creation of Canada as a democracy, individual rights and freedoms have been expanded. In the 1960s, social mores were loosening, and this brought about many changes to laws and society in general. Pierre Trudeau was asked in the late 1960s about legal changes, Bill C 150, that granted rights on the issues of sexual preference and reproductive choice. He answered this: well, it's certainly the most extensive revision of the criminal code since the new criminal code of the early 1950s. It's bringing the laws of the land up to contemporary society. I think. Take this thing on homosexuality. I think the view we take here is that there is no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. And I think that what's done in private between adults does not concern the criminal code. When it becomes public, this is a different matter. So if we looked at this quote and we didn't know anything about Pierre Trudeau, we could kind of get a sense of his um, ideological beliefs, right? So one, he believed that government has no place in dictating something like homosexuality, right? So that removal of government is an individualist principle. It has a lot more to do with individual freedom. Moving on, we're going to talk about private property. So, modern understandings of property law developed during the Enlightenment in England. At first, property law was understood to only apply to land, real estate, but it eventually came to apply to three types of property: real estate, other forms of physical possessions, and intellectual property. Okay, so I'll just go through those three, right? My home, or anyone who owns a home and owns land, that is their private property, that is their real estate, right? And any physical possessions that they have is also their property, right? So the computer that I'm working on right now is mine. It is my physical possession. It is my private property. My phone, my private property. The clothes that I have on, my private property, right? And then intellectual property. So these slides, for example, are slides that are made by me. And a lot of the things that I am saying are coming from me. So it could be argued that that's intellectual property. However, it differs when I am being paid for something, because then technically the school division owns that property. It's their private property. Right? But if I was to make an art piece or write a song or anything of that nature, that would also be my property. And to, let's say, steal or copy it would be violating my private property. So, with that said, the notion of private property is only one way of looking at land and property. There are many different perspectives regarding the significance of people's relationship to land. And when we talk about collectivism, we're going to talk about public property. So, I'm going to throw back to talking about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in relationship to private property. Okay, so in a lot of their perspective, land reflects a person's interrelationship with nature and all living things. Some peoples also believe that land cannot be owned, cannot be private, but rather has to be shared. Some communities also have had a tradition of common property shared by, worked by, and enjoyed by a collective. Such a difference in perspective on land ownership has sometimes led to conflict among Indigenous peoples and the British and Canadian government, right? So even as it exists today, the majority of Canada is private property, even though the original inhabitants of this land used collectivist principles in terms of common ownership over property. The protection of private property can also be a source of conflict in the realm of intellectual property. For example, biotechnological companies expend large amounts of time and money developing new patents for plants, such as drought resistant wheat that can benefit society as a whole. Farmers who grow these varieties often pay royalties to the companies who own the patents. It is not always clear, however, whether the newly created plant varieties are significantly different from the existing crops that have been grown for centuries. The next principle is economic freedom. On a personal level, economic freedom is the freedom to buy what you want and sell your labor, idea, or product to whomever you wish. Markets in which consumers and businesses have free choice to buy, sell, or trade without government interference in those transactions are called free markets. Economic freedom for free market entrepreneurs would mean that there are no barriers to trade for products that they might want to export, and that their customers would not have to pay taxes on their purchases. The Economic Freedom Index, compiled by the Wall Street Journal, rates the economic freedom of 157 countries according to the following 10 factors: business freedom, trade freedom, tax freedom, the degree of government regulation, monetary freedom, investment freedom, financial freedom, property rights, freedom from corruption, and labor freedom. In 2008, Canada was ranked 10th on this list, which is actually pretty good. But if you see a lot of freedoms, right? Word and then freedom after it, right? When we talk about tax freedom, freedom from taxes, trade freedom, right? Means that it's very easy to trade a product or money. Whenever it gets harder, then you are restricting freedom. The reason for its ranking is that Canada intervenes in its market rather than leaving them free from government regulation. So that's why we're 10th and not like top five. After the Great Depression of the 1930s, Canada implemented policies designed to create a social safety net for Canadians. Uh, the Unemployment Insurance Act, the Canadian Pension Plan, and the Medicare Act, right? And other acts that transformed Canada into more of a welfare state than necessarily a completely free economic state, right? So, employment insurance, we don't get to pick and choose if we pay EI out of our paycheck. It is required, so we don't have the freedom to say, no, I don't want to spend my money on EI. But what that means is if we are ever unemployed, then we can access that. Same with the Canadian Pension Plan. We do not choose if we want CPP deducted off of our paycheck. It is forced. But what that means is that every Canadian has access to old age pension if they want. Okay, Medicare Act as well, universal free healthcare. Right, I have not chosen as an individual to for my tax dollars to go to hospitals and healthcare. It is something that's been mandated, but it's something for the common good. So it's pushed Canada a little bit away from economic freedom. So we're still really free. We still get a big chunk of our paycheck to spend on whatever we like. But the portion that is taken is put on things that are good for the collective or the common good. So I'll describe welfare state a little bit more. It's one in which the economy is free. So, like Canada, we have a free market, but the government uses policies that directly or indirectly modify the market a little bit and forces economic stability in some things and a basic standard of living for citizens, right? So we want to be able to, if you're struggling or anything like that, to be able to kind of meet people where they are. Next principle is self interest and competition. Two concepts of individualism closely related to the principles of economic freedom are self interest and competition. Supporters of individualism see economic freedom as leading to the most efficient and beneficial economy for the greatest number of people because it encourages competition, right? If people are constantly trying to be better and better and better, people who believe in individualist ideologies think that that's best for society. And people generally act in their self interest, right? So I want a better life for myself, so I'm going to work hard to get that life for myself. So these ideas were first promoted in the 18th century. Scottish philosopher and economist Adam Smith, who saw individual self interest as an invisible hand that guides individuals to contribute to the common good for everyone. In this view, the forces of supply and demand in the market work to the benefit of the majority. When there is too much supply of a product, the price drops, and eventually so does the supply. When the demand is greater than the supply, the price of the product rises, and more entrepreneurs enter the market to profit, eventually causing supply to meet the demand, right? So, for example, happening right now, summer of 2022, there's a really low supply of vehicles, right? And that low supply of vehicles is driving up the price of vehicles. So it's more expensive to get into a vehicle. However, because the price is so high, a lot of car companies are trying to ramp up supply. And once that supply goes up, the price will drop or let even out, right? So supply and demand are really vital to competition and the free market. Okay, I am going to take a break here. So I'm going to turn this into a part one and a part two. I hope that you also take a chance to take a break right now because this is a lot of information. So if you want to go do a little bit of your assignment or take a break from listening to me, this is a great time to do it. So I will see you in a bit.